In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Olive. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. Olive, as a tone in green, is generally duller and a muted, dusty tone, which is being done very well here. I do feel a slight pull towards gray with this. Only slight tone variation occurs by Nib, but also it manages to really shade very nicely and pretty regularly. This green does so much so well, but I do wish it was a little bit darker. An effect you can get when writing on cream paper. Cream paper is where it really looks the best, and unfortunately I kind of forgot to film that part when I was doing the writing, so perhaps I'll remember to go ahead and get a picture of this up onto Instagram or something. If I forget, someone remind me. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a D-like Alpha with a Fude type nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the PO nib, you see how light this is. Now, this is a very, very fine and very dry pen, but we also see that little pull towards gray with this. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. It's shading pretty well. In fact, the darker areas where it shades is where I would really like to see this color when writing with it. In general, I find the tone here to be a little too light for me. Looking at the Aero Fine nib, it is quite a bit darker because it's quite a bit wetter as a pen. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade really well. I think the tones we're getting here are some of the better tones that we're going to get with this ink when it comes to the pen is wet enough and really putting it down to let this color show for what an olive green really should be. Looking at the Architect nib, it is a bit lighter than it was with the Aero Fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading just as well as that Aero Fine nib. The most noticeable thing is really how just like the Fine nib this is, just that it's coming out from a different shaped nib. Very consistent in its performance, which is a good thing in general to me. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a TWSBI Vac Mini with a posting nib, a TWSBI Eco with an Aero nib that is fine, a TWSBI Mini with an Architect, The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the posting nib, I think this is just a little bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine, which I think is working in the advantage here. This is looking fairly good to me as a comparison. Now, it's not feathering and it's not spreading. It is still shading even on this more absorbent paper. I can see this as actually being very useful in this notebook because of the performance and your ability to write really small on these pages. Looking at the Aerofine nib, we see that it is a bit darker than we had with the posting. It's about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading incredibly well. Again, we're getting the nicest tone and the nicest performance from this ink with this wetter Aerofine nib. Very nice here. Great with this paper. Looking at the Architect nib, it is lighter than we had with the Aerofine and still quite a bit darker than we had with the posting nib. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading really well. The tone is the same tone that we were getting on the Clairfontaine, giving this ink a very consistent performance. There's only this slight, really, tone variation in that it's more frequently the lighter tone, but it's largely the same, just more frequently the lighter than the fine. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and no problem writing back here. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, it is just a tad bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine, a little bit lighter than we had on the WritePad. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is giving a little bit of shading. You can really see it in topology, in study, records. But the difference in tone that's happening for the shading is very subtle, and it's really rolling in and out nicely. I think they call that the ombre effect, if I remember the word correctly. Looking at the Aerofine nib, darker than it was with the posting. I want to say it's about as dark as what we had with the Clairfontaine, yet slightly different. And that's because this is not really a white page, but a little off-white, which is affecting the tone just a little bit. And I think it is even a little bit nicer here. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the cream tone of paper really helped this ink, and it is helping it here, although we're not seeing as much shading as we did in previous writing samples. Looking at the Architect nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the Aerofine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. No, why did I say that? I have no idea. I just got on a roll. It is shading, and it's shading as well as it did every other time with the Architect nib. I'm just being a fool when I said that. I got in a rhythm, man. It happens. And I'm leaving this one in. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and no problem writing back here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We do get some shading, just a bit less shading than we had on the Clairfontaine, but it is still definitely there. And this is a paper that doesn't normally really bring out the shading in ink, but it manages to show up today. Looking at the Aero Fine nib, we get a darker tone than the posting nib, about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get about the same amount of shading that we had on the Clairfontaine, making this a very consistent performer across a lot of different papers. So for people that use non-fountain pen paper, this is a pretty darn good green as long as you're getting it into that right pen. Looking at the Architect nib, we get the same tone that we had with the Aero Fine, the same tone that it was giving on the Clairfontaine. We're getting no feather, we're getting no spread. We are getting shading. I say it a bunch and I'm going to always say it with it. I believe this nib, if you are a print writer, is going to really step up the way that your handwriting looks, much like how a stub nib really helps out cursive writers. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, easily writing on the backs. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Krishna Thulsi. Here is Noodler's Army. Here is Organic Studios Dark Green. Here is Robert Oster Moss. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, we have a little bit darker tone than we had with the Clairfontaine. Just a little bit, but I do think it's making the tone look a little bit nicer. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It's got a few moments of some shading that's really happening. Look at because. Right on the E to C, you see it lighten up through, and then gets a little darker on that last E. The tone shift is very mild here. Looking at the Aero Fine nib, which is a bit wetter, and with that, putting down more, we get a little bit of feather. It's very tiny, and a little bit of spread. It's very tiny. A little bit of shading, but I'm a little worried about the shading in this case. The tone is consistent with what we had with the Clairfontaine. Consistent, slightly darker, just the littlest bit. Looking at the Architect nib, we get around the same tone than we had with the Aero Fine. It just shows off more of the lighter tones with that. Now, it does feather a little bit. It does spread just a little bit. It does shade some. Although shading for this paper usually is a warning sign, I don't think it looks too bad, and I'm hoping it does good on the back. Looking at the page underneath, it was only the Aero Fine nib that had a couple spots that bled through touching that page. Seeing the back of the page, you see that there is a lot of ghosting. Now, I'm not sure if you could use the back of the page, but you might get away with it with the posting nib. While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Monteverde, their Mandarin Orange. Here is a purple ink by Sailor, their Storia Magic Purple, a pigmented ink. Here is a black ink by Zenzoi, Black. Here is a red ink by Krishna, their Manavadam. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the posting nib, we get a bit darker tone than we had with the Clairfontaine, around the same tone as that last paper. It does feather really, really tiny. You have to really go looking for it, but it is there, not a problem. There is the slightest bit of spread, and it's like going from an ultra extra fine to an extra fine. So it's doing really good. Is it shading? No, but there is some tone variation within the writing. Looking at the Aero Fine nib, we get a darker tone than we had with the posting, a little bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. We do get a little bit of feather. We do get a little bit of spread. We do get a little bit of shading. I expect we get a little bit of bleed through just because of how that's going. I think you could use this on this paper if you wanted to, and it wouldn't be horrible. Looking at the Architect nib, we have around the same tone that we had with the Aero Fine. We do have feather. We do have spread. Both of those should be expected. We do have some shading going on, and I'm hoping it doesn't bleed through because that would be kind of a win if you love using an Architect nib. With this ink, you may be able to get away with it on this paper. Yeah, the feather, the spread's there. We know it's going to be there, so you have to accept it some. Looking at the page underneath, only one dot touched that page from the Aero Fine. Otherwise, nothing bled through and touched those pages. And look at the back of the page, how nice that is. There's very little ghosting, especially with the posting nib. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Any regular to wet flow pen will give a great tone with very nice shading. I would avoid dry pens as the tone gets too light and starts to look like the color's kind of washed out. So while it's very consistent, just make sure that you're using a wetter pen if you like it darker like I do. Now, if you really like that light tone, then go for the dry pen. More than anything, I think whatever pen you use it on, go for cream paper, and it's really going to make this ink pop. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.